You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Dr. Laura Outhwaite and I'm a Principal Research Fellow at the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. I'm also a UKRI Policy Fellow. In this season of Research for the Real World, it's all about how research evidence informs policy. We're recording this episode on Tuesday the 11th of June, a little over 3 weeks from the UK election day on the 4th of July, when political parties are laying out their policy proposals ahead of elections. The UK isn't the only country going to polls this year. Did you know that 2024 is a year when globally more voters than ever in history will head to polls to take part in their national elections? In this season, we'll be hearing from researchers whose work encompasses a mixture of policy, social sciences, and of course education, and we'll be finding out what they think about the current state of democracy. Today, I'm delighted to have Marc Stears and Hugh Morris in the studio. A professor of political science, Marc is also UCL's first pro-provost of policy engagement and director of the UCL Policy Lab. Marc has previously been director of the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney. He was CEO of the New Economics Foundation. He's also a professor of political theory at the University of Oxford and was a chief speechwriter to the UK Labour Party. Hugh is an honorary professor of tertiary education at IOE and is on secondment from the Welsh Government working on research development and policy engagement activities. Prior to this role, Hugh was a Director of Skills, Higher Education and Lifelong Learning for 9 years, overseeing a range of reforms to the student finance system, governance arrangements for post-compulsory education, and the development of apprenticeships. I'm very excited to hear about your insights and discuss your fascinating work with you both today. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Marc and Hugh.
Great to be here.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks, Laura.
So, Marc, I wanted to get us started today on the podcast with something that you have written that was posted on the UCL website on the 24th of May, 2024. So it reads, "For all the political drama of the last 5 years, there's been a sense of half-finished verse, the discarded doodles of a picture never fully finished. Alongside political leadership and cutting-edge ideas, it will require ordinary people to deliver on the promise of change." So, how can cross-cutting ideas developed by experts in our universities help policymakers meet the challenges of the modern Britain today?
Thank you so much, Laura. Great question to begin our discussion with, and it's wonderful to be here on the podcast. I think the key issue that I'm interested in and that you've touched on in that quote is that we all know that universities are sort of packed full of incredibly clever people working incredibly hard and coming up with incredibly exciting ideas. And yet at the same time, many people in universities are frustrated that those ideas don't find themselves into the sort of political mainstream. They're very rarely talked about in election campaigns. They don't turn up in election manifestos. They don't even make it into the pages of fancy newspapers like the Times or the Guardian often. And that understandably creates, as I say, sort of frustration and impatience on university campuses. I've spent a long, long time thinking about that. And I think I've come to the conclusion that one of the reasons that that's the case, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that we haven't spent enough time or effort at universities building the coalitions with those people outside the university who can then carry those ideas into new spaces. So too often we end up writing journals for academic sort of publications or teaching our students, which of course are great things to do, but we're not taking our ideas into conversations with community groups or campaigners or trade unions or progressively minded businesses. And really finding people who we can excite and engage and who therefore will have more punch when it comes to our political processes.
No, excellent. It really reminds me of, my own kind of experiences of working in some of these like more policy spaces. So I'm currently doing a secondment with Ofsted as part of the UKRI Policy Fellowship Scheme. And I think what's been so far my kind of greatest reflection is just how important the relationships are with people in these spaces. And people, like working with people they know that they can trust. And so if we can forge these relationships, it just is part of that stepping stone to kind of make those wider connections. So yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, totally. I think that's spot on. I love the fact that you've used that word relationship, because it reminds me that one of the first people to teach me all this was a great mentor of mine called Arnie Graf from the US. And Arnie always used to say, relationship precedes action always. And he'd just say, look, spend the time meeting the people, talking to them, listening to their concerns, thinking about what your common interests are before you sort of race to tell them your ideas or try to get them on side, and really taking the time and making the effort to do that, probably happens too rarely on our campuses nowadays.
Absolutely. So as part of your Ordinary Hope project, which has the involvement of a number of IOE researchers, could you tell us a little bit more about the project and how you're hoping that it could bring about change?
Yeah, when I came back to London from Sydney, I was in Sydney for 5 years, and then I came back to London and I was, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I went out for a cup of coffee in Dalston in East London with my good friend Graham Cook, who at that point was working for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a charitable foundation that cares about poverty. And Graham and I had a kind of long conversation, and it came to sort of very clearly to us in that chat that the problem in terms of policy making to tackle poverty, or at least one of the problems, was this relationship one, which is that there were wonderful academics, there were brilliant campaigners, there were fantastic sort of politicians, there were great journalists, there were political strategists, but none of them kind of knew each other. And we thought, well, if we could build a team of people with diverse experience and expertise, perhaps we could really put rocket fuel underneath the debate about poverty alleviation. And so that's what we did. And we went back to the UCL campus and found people like Lindsay McMillan at the IOE and Xiaowei Zhu at the economics department. And Graham found people from his charitable world and philanthropic world. And then we found people from the political world. And we created a group of 15 people who meet once a month now, share their particular interests and their particular expertise, and have tried to build a sort of shared project which hopefully takes the messages from each of those worlds into the other. And it's been terrific fun, hugely energizing. And here in the UK, it's enabled us to take messages right into the heart of the political machine in a way that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So, Graham Cook has now left Joseph Rowntree Foundation and has gone to work for the Labour Party. And, he therefore is a bridge into that world. But all these different kinds of people connecting together regularly, as you said, coming to trust each other and like each other, has been the heart of what Ordinary Hope has been about.
No, that's great. And it's great to hear that you've been having some of these emerging successes as well. So Hugh, what's been your kind of personal approach to undertaking research that informs policy? Do you have any similar stories to share?
I think a lot of what you've just said resonates for me. It's always been about marrying research with policy and practice and trying to make sure that each of those things inform the other. A personal mantra for me throughout my life has been try to be part of the solution to the problem your boss doesn't know that they will be facing in the future. It's about anticipating what the needs might be and then trying to find out what's going on. And as you've both said, establishing the relationships to make that happen. My personal career over the last 35 years or more has been about crossing the boundaries between policy and research. As a researcher in the mid-80s, I was doing a project looking at evaluating the impact of then Conservative government's trade union legislation on what was happening to working practices and trade union activity. And that took me into a number of government departments and into workplaces. And that became a theme in a range of other policies and research activities I've been involved in since. So when I went back into working full-time in universities, it was about anticipating what e-learning and new technology was going to do to how universities operated. It was about thinking about how you develop research capability and capacity in institutions that didn't have that tradition. It's been about trying to get the best relationships between colleges, universities, apprenticeship providers, adult education, so that everybody in the community has access to the learning that they might want. And more recently, it's been about engaging with the devolved governments obviously in Wales, where I was for 9 years, but more recently in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then in recent months working with the government in the Republic of Ireland. And those experiences have made me feel that the challenge over the next 5 to 10 years is about building capability and capacity in communities and in regions, particularly in England. England's one of the most highly centralised nations in the world in terms of its political governance and its commercial organisation. And if we are going to spread the benefits of a modern age more broadly, we do need to do that more locally. And I was very inspired a couple of years ago when I read Marc's earlier book, Out of the Ordinary, How Everyday Life Inspired a Nation and How It Can Happen Again. And I had a conversation with him at the time about the experiences of people in the 1930s and how they'd gone about doing that. And I very much see the opportunity to recreate a bit of that through municipalism and local community engagement and so forth. So, yeah, that's a little bit of an outline.
No, that's great. And it's interesting to hear how there's sort of similarities between the two of you. So just to push a bit further. So when the shoe's on the other foot, what role do you think research has for policymakers, especially when it's commissioned? So rather than it being, us as researchers trying to influence policy, what are your reflections on it kind of working the other way?
Well, my first reflection would be, again, echoing something Marc said earlier, which is first seek to understand before you seek to be understood. So you need to understand the other people's worlds. I'm not an anthropologist, but I do believe that the culture of academia and the culture of government and policymaking are completely different. And I'm constantly slightly surprised and worryingly bemused by the mutual incomprehension of one another's worlds. The terminology, the ways of working, there's a tendency, wrongly, for people on both sides to assume that the others don't know what they're doing or don't know what they're talking about because they don't understand how they work. So I think a lot more can be done to encourage that. And part of what I've been doing the last 2 years in the Institute and with government is trying to encourage more fellowships of the sort that you're on, Laura. So I did a lot of work with the ESRC on the mid-career fellowship scheme. I've been doing an evaluation of those fellowship schemes in both directions, both civil servants into academia and academics into the civil service, just to find out how those relationships are working and how they could be made to be better. So I would strongly encourage that. Back again to the future. So we have 165 universities in the UK. We have 404 higher education providers, and we have something like 80 policy institutes operating in those 165 universities. Now, academics love medium strength anarchy. Civil servants don't. So what we need to do is to try to encourage that wild garden of academic activity, be just ever so slightly more organised to make it easier for policymakers to engage with them. And that's what I think part of the next stage is going to be, is building that regional capability and capacity, because local and regional government has been completely denuded of that capability in recent years, and academia's got a lot to offer. So through bodies like the University Policy Engagement Network, UPenn, and funded programs like CAPE, I think there's a lot that can be done there. And I would be encouraging people associated with the comprehensive spending review that will happen in 2025 in central government, and the spending priorities of government research bodies like Research England, UKRI, but also charitable foundations like the Nuffield Foundation and the Roundtree Foundation and others, to be thinking about how they can make that happen in a better, slightly more coordinated way. Because if I'm sitting as a policymaker, I don't want 88 people to come and talk to me about the same issue. As much as they might give me a variety of different perspectives, it's not going to make my diary any easier.
No, it's very true. And yeah, how to sort of funnel that through in an accessible way, which kind of links to your earlier point, Marc, about, that kind of like translational evidence. And, academics, we love our kind of jargon. We love our really long academic articles that quite frankly are quite dense sometimes. It's that, what's the headline? What's your elevator pitch essentially? And yeah, just touching on your reflection there, Hugh, about the opportunities involved with the fellowships and things, like for myself in the last 6 months, have just so far really valued the opportunity to almost see under the hood, or the car bonnet, shall we say, of, how this, the civil service or these, policy orientated organizations work and function, and to, use that to build the relationships and hopefully have research impact that goes beyond just the fellowship in itself. But I don't want to attempt fate too much. So, Marc, I'm going to come back to you. So you've recently published a book called England, 7 Myths That Changed the Nation and How to Set Them Straight with Tom Baldwin. Could you firstly tell us what these 7 myths are?
Thank you. Yeah. So it was a book that Tom and I wrote in the pandemic. So I was at the start stuck in Australia, and Tom, who some of your listeners will know, is a journalist and political strategist, recent author of a best-selling biography of Keir Starmer. Tom was stuck in London, and no one could go out their houses, and we were sort of reflecting on what had happened to the country before the pandemic. And as, again, most listeners will be aware, England had been in a really angry place, I guess, for a decade. Really intense rows about Brexit and about the future of the economy, about cultural issues, immigration, trans rights, many other issues. It felt sort of really tense. And Tom and I wanted to know, I think in a spirit of sort of those early COVID days, was there a better country that we could find? And what was the cause of all the anger in the first place? And connecting with the theme of this discussion, what we quickly discovered, I think, is that when you get people to talk about the real world and their actual relationships and the towns or villages in which they live, or their families or their everyday aspirations, then there's an awful lot of agreement and consensus across difference here in the UK that people might not necessarily agree in, sort of fundamental ways, but they can see other people's points of view and they can get on well with each other. But when you start sort of abstracting and going big and having big arguments about, whether the English, the British Empire was something to be proud of or not, or whether England invented liberty and cares about it more than European countries do, or whether, everything about, the British past is terrible and ought to be sort of deleted and we ought to stride into a globalized future. At that point, people really get cross, and you have these intense and sort of uncrossable divides between people. And so Tom and I wanted to check that hypothesis, and we had conversations with all kinds of people: politicians, academics, campaigners, grassroots communities. And sure enough, what we found is that talking about the everyday, you have the possibilities of building, something pleasant again. Talking about these big, booming abstractions and myths, people get into incredible rows. And so our sort of takeaway from that is, if we're going to research about the country, argue about the country, think about the future of the country's politics, then the way to build community again, or cohesion or solidarity, is to begin small and then only cautiously move big. And that's the contention of the book, if you like, is that, of course, we, as academics, we all want to have these big booming conversations about, the abstractions of life. But actually, if we care about building social connection again, taking the temperature down, making some real concrete steps forward, then we need to be a little less ambitious in our thinking and a little bit more focused on the sort of everyday elements of life. And that's the contention of the book.
That sounds really interesting. And I'm just, as you were talking, looking to see where I could get a copy from.
All good bookshops, and some bad ones too.
Excellent. I'll have to add it to my reading list. So just linking back to some of the things that Hugh was saying, do you have any kind of reflections, maybe combined with what Hugh had said, as well as what you'd kind of written about in your book around essentially this relationship between research and policy making?
I mean, I think Hugh put it all so brilliantly. I mean, I love that idea about sort of mutual incomprehension. That's, I think, the primary problem in the research policy maker conversation, which is that just people have different ways of looking at the world. And what we need to do is we need to spend the time understanding those before we then race into doing something about it. And that really is about humility. It's about care. It's about connection. And it's about, starting, again, Hugh said it really well, which is, too often both academics get angry with policymakers because they think they're all sort of, too shrill or too quick or like not serious and caveated enough. And policymakers get angry with academics because everything takes so long and it's all so cautious and complex and there are so many footnotes. There are reasons for those two cultures, and we've got to find some kind of common ground if we're going to make sort of headway together. But you can only build that common ground by spending time together, doing the kind of work that you're doing, Laura. So I think that's the primary insight. And it doesn't sound like sort of rocket science, but the incentive structures of both the policy world and the academic world, often mitigate against just spending time in relational conversations, getting to understand each other and getting to know each other. And I wish we could do something about that.
No, that's great. And I'm going to push you both on this one. You can decide who answers first. But I'm just really interested to hear, because you've obviously given some really insightful principles and kind of insights into how we can make these things work. But do you have any kind of concrete examples of any kind of success stories with anything that you've done in your work where you're like, we did this in academia and this has led to a change in, attitude or policy or practice in any kind of way? So yeah, race to the buzzer.
Well, I can think of a few, but they were never just me on my own. In terms of government policy, in Wales, we introduced a number of reforms to student finance and funding that then were taken up and considered not only in Wales, but in other countries. And similarly, we pioneered the development of what we call tertiary education, so bringing together those different parts of post-compulsory education that I talked about earlier, and that has become part of a broader debate. Most recently in Australia with the Australian Universities Accord. I would like to just also pick up on something, though, that Marc's talked about. For me, particularly for younger researchers, maybe undergraduates, people doing a PhD or freshly completed, I also think it's worth thinking locally about what you can do in community organisations and in local government and with regional, because you'll get more traction and you'll learn valuable lessons. If you start by thinking, I'll write to the Prime Minister with a 10-point plan of what he needs to do in his first 100 days, you may not get an answer. But if you go and see your local councillors, or if you go and see your local voluntary groups and offer to work with them, you will learn as much as they will learn, and a lot can come from that. And another bit, I've been fortunate in my career to work and live in lots of different places, particularly in the UK. So I spent a long time living in London as a young person, and then I spent time in Bristol in the southwest and in the northwest in Manchester, and then spent time in the northeast and a long time in Wales. And what I learned is there is a lot that's similar, but there's also a lot that's different. And one of the books I think Marc refers to in his earlier book is J.B. Priestley's English Journey, where J.B. Priestley went round the different parts of the UK. And other people have trod that path subsequently. George Orwell's A Road to Wigan Pier. And most recently, Stuart Maconie's written a book which retraces J.B. Priestley's footsteps. And I just think understanding locality is really important, particularly for national people or people based in London. Because when public opinion surveys are done about university research, they say, yes, it's great and it's wonderful and we see the value of it, but could more of it be done that affects where I live? Could more of it be done near where I live? So I would just encourage people to do a bit more of that, because I think it will help to bind us together a bit better.
No, that's great, Hugh. And yeah, the kind of conversations around place have been very much, within my kind of academic circles at the moment, we've really been thinking about that and kind of regional differences and, people's sense of belonging in their place. And, it's something that we should be trying to capture. Do you have any additional thought, Marc?
Yeah, I mean, I love that point about place and locality and belonging, and starting with the councillors. I think that's absolutely spot on. You can make so much headway and learn so many lessons there. I mean, the example that I wanted to give of where I think this relational approach can make a difference, though is a kind of quite a big one, which is when I was in Australia during the pandemic. As some people will be aware, the Australian government closed its borders very early on, and then didn't really get round to vaccinating its population, and therefore had a real problem. Whereas everybody else vaccinated and the world got back to something like close to normal, it was really hard for the Australian government to know how to respond. And when I was at the University of Sydney, we decided that we could help a little bit here if we created connections and relationships between lots of different organizations, all of whom wanted to open the border again, but wanted to do it safely. So we used the university's sort of convening power to bring together refugee charities and the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and PwC, the accountancy firm, and the Law Council, who cared about sort of legal issues, and public health academics, epidemiologists, and sort of experts in nursing and community care. and managed to get all of these people who had a shared interest but didn't have a shared experience of working together to come up with a plan for how we might be able to open the border again. And it was a fantastic piece of experience and learning. It was slow, it was hard, there were arguments along the way. But it was great because it ended up on the front page of The Australian, which is the major newspaper in Australia. And a handful of weeks later, Scott Morrison, who was then the Australian Prime Minister, unveiled his own plan, which was uncannily similar to the one that we had come up with. And as always in politics, you never get the credit, but it's really nice to see the outcome. And that sort of example of how somewhat slow, somewhat uncomfortable relational work where people are getting to know each other can actually have a major input on, really complicated public policy debate was really exciting.
No, that's really great to hear. And yeah, thank you for the insights and concrete examples. So to finish off, my final question to both of you is, if you had a direct line to the next UK government, what would you say to whoever wins about the importance of considering research evidence when making policy decisions that affect millions of citizens?
Well, I'll just say two things quickly. The first is there is quite a lot of documentation in government about how to do this. It's not uniformly followed. So there are things like the Magenta Book, which spells out how government departments and officials and ministers should be aware of evidence, commission evidence, how they should evaluate programs. So it would be good if more people knew about that. And that's not just in government, it's also amongst researchers. And the second thing I'd say, which I've said a few times already, is about building up regional capability and capacity. Because if we don't have a more even spread of that expertise, we're just going to continue to repeat the challenges that we've had for the last 3 or 4 decades of uneven development, both economically but also culturally.
I mean, very similarly, really, we've been working closely here at UCL with another philanthropic foundation called the This Day Foundation, which was founded by a South African businessman called Gary Lubner, who used to work in windscreens, car windscreens, bizarrely. Autoglass was one of his companies. But Gary Lubner became engaged in social change or political change, policy change, when he suddenly realized that the way a business succeeds is by building an ecosystem. So you have, an R&D structure, you have commercial expertise, you have good, deep relationships with your customers, your regulators, local authorities and national authorities. And then when he looked at the policy-making world, he said, it just doesn't work like that. You've got people in silos or in isolation, sat in offices in civil service departments in Whitehall or Westminster or wherever. And so this day he founded to create an ecosystem for a potential new government in the UK where you could create networks between researchers, politicians, senior civil servants, and all the various other people who are necessary to come up with good policy. And so I think if I was talking to an incoming government, I would say that, which is that primary insight is the right one, which is you can only have good policy if you have a strong ecosystem. And the government will need to engage properly with that ecosystem, like listen to them and not just listen to themselves, and B, do what it can to facilitate and support the ecosystem for the long term, because lots of these organizations need encouragement and resource and finance, and government, after all, can provide an awful lot of that.
That's great. Thanks again for your really insightful thoughts on everything. And yeah, hopefully if they are listening to the Research for the Real World podcast, they might take some of that advice. But indeed, like you say, you've built those relationships, you've built some of those ecosystems yourselves with a lot of the work that you have been doing. So yeah, good luck. So thank you, Hugh and Marc. It has been really interesting to get to know both of you and all about your research. So thank you again for coming on the podcast. You just heard from Marc Stears, Professor of Political Science and Director of the UCL Policy Lab, and Hugh Morris, Honorary Professor of Tertiary Education at IOE. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 22 past seasons. Just search IOE Podcasts to find the episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from IOE. And a quick favour before I go, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show, and that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Laura, and thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor. Amy Leibowitz is the series producer. And Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.